At this time, I'd like to call the Anacortes City Council meeting for January 11th, 2021 to order. Ms. Hunt, would you take the roll?
Mr. Carter,
Here.
Mr. Young,
Here.
Mr. Walters,
Here.
Ms. Cleveland McGrath,
Here.
Ms. Moulton,
Here.
Mr. McDougall,
Here.
Mr. Miller.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we're going to move on to agenda item 2, which is announcements and committee reports. And I'm going to start with 2A, which is our COVID-19 update. And as of today, January 11th, Island Hospital has tested 10,622 people over the course of the pandemic. They've had 217 people test positive with their testing. They've admitted 35 people to the hospital, and we've had 0 deaths in Anacortes. In Skagit County, as of today, we've had 3,389 positive cases, 43 deaths, and 206 people hospitalized. Compared to a month ago, we had 2,462 positive cases, 31 deaths, and 162 people hospitalized. So this last month has been pretty substantial in the uptick in the disease and tragic loss of life. Skagit County Health Department also projects currently today in the 98221 zip code, there are 293 current positive cases of COVID-19. This is an increase of 927 cases in the last month in Skagit County, an increase of 44 hospitalizations and 12 deaths in the last month also in the county. In Washington State, we have had 271,595 cases, 3,698 deaths. United States, we've had 22.5 million cases, and we now are at the point of 375,000 deaths in the United States. Worldwide, it's confirmed that we've had 89 million cases, including 1.9 million deaths. So in addition to my COVID update, I also want to touch on vaccines. And the Skagit County continues to vaccinate all those that are eligible in the 1A category. And if you are, or you hear of someone that's eligible and you haven't been able to get vaccinated, please call, they ask that you call the health department to find out where you can get that. And that is 360-416-1500. 360-416-1500. In 1A category are high-risk healthcare workers in healthcare setting, high-risk first responders, long-term care facility residents, and all workers at risk in the healthcare setting. And that's the category right now that they are vaccinating. So right now, their ability to vaccinate folks is dependent on our allocation, and week by week, the numbers, the amount of vaccines they get varies. So they've asked the state for increased doses every week. And I think at that point, that's what I have now. We are also, we're in the governor's new Healthy Washington Roadmap to Recovery, and we are in what we call the North region, and that is Watkins, Skagit, San Juan, and Island County. And we today are in phase 1, and to move forward to phase 2, all 4 counties in our region have to reach the metrics that are set aside. And I don't have those in front of me tonight, but it's based a lot like what we saw before, how many hospital beds are available, staying below a certain percentage in new cases every week. And to date, we're all in phase 1, and we're not, at least for this week, we're not moving into phase 2. So that's my report tonight on that. Does anyone have any questions on COVID or vaccines?
Mayor Gear.
Here.
Mr. Young, then Mr. Miller, and then Mr. McDougall. Mr. Young.
Just wanted to find out, there's been a lot of discussion about other counties having already exhausted or serviced, they believe, their 1A people, and that they had some vaccine left over that wasn't used. And I think that, from what I understand, I think Whidbey itself was indicating that they were going to share part of theirs with Skagit. So between the counties, they're really trying to work together to make sure everybody's, getting the vaccination, because there were some people going to other counties because they were already gearing up for 1B.
That is correct. I've heard Island County has been very generous, and many of our healthcare professionals have gone down to Island County and received their first dose. So, Mr. Miller?
Yeah, my question, and I think a fellow council member brought it up last week. Does anybody, I haven't found it anywhere, is anybody counting vaccines as they go out? Because I think that's a positive, a more positive number to try to get out there, and a worthwhile number too.
Reporting that next week, but the information on vaccines is not as coming out as quickly as I'd like from the county.
Okay, thank you.
But I'll work on that. Mr. McDougall?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. There were reports in the newspaper that that Skagit County had not received like similar allocations to that neighboring counties had gotten, and it was basically sounded like it was an oversight from the state health department. Has the county health department gotten any update on that? Like if we're gonna get our, get bumped up to our expected share?
I don't get briefed till Wednesday. I know they've been working very closely with the State Department of Health. I know they did a piece on, I think, Channel 5. I think they got some attention that way. But yeah, it was remarkable. Skagit County got like 1,500 doses 1 week, whereas Island got 8,000.
Yeah.
And so there was definitely a glitch in the system somewhere. So I'm sure, like any new program, things get worked out as they move forward. Okay, anything else on that? All right, so next week, Mr. Miller, I will add that. I like that. How many vaccines have we given out to date? Give us some hope for getting us all there. Yeah, I have one other item, and I'm just going to call it the second part of my report, and it's just legislative priorities. With COVID, the end of year, and projects I've had on my plate, I'm just now working on our legislative priorities to present to our legislators in Olympia. And if you have anything you want me to focus on so I can bring it forward to you in the next couple of weeks, please feel free to do that. AWC, these are the ones coming from the actual AWC Association. Their priorities for this year is state shared revenues, maintaining revenue sharing with cities, transportation revenue package, adopt a new transportation revenue package that emphasizes maintenance and preservation funding in a more fair, equitable way. Fiscal flexibility provides cities greater flexibility to use funds from existing revenue sources to help cities manage the impact of economic downturn. This will allow the cities to direct scarce resources where they're most needed. Housing stability assistance, work in coalition to develop additional resources to address housing instability created by the economic impacts of COVID-19. And then their final one is statewide policing reforms, support local control over city law enforcement policy decisions to meet the needs of each community and appropriately contain costs. Cities understand their obligations to address racial equity in policing in both state requirements and local policies. So that's the flavor of what AWC is bringing forward. We can incorporate some of those and we can add our own. So maybe in our one-on-ones this next week, we touch on this and we get it to you in the next 2 weeks and we'll get it to Olympia. All right, that's all I have there. Any questions? All right, we'll move on now to item 2B, which is our Port City Liaison Committee report.
Mayor Gear,
Miss Cleland McGrath.
Thank you. So we had our monthly meeting. Councilmember Young and Councilmember Carter were in attendance with myself and city staff. It was a really positive meeting. We kind of hit on the great successes that each entity has had over the last year of 2020 through all of the challenges, and then looking forward towards 2021. The big thing is the port had a pretty successful year. They put a lot of capital improvement investments into our community, which helped our sales tax base. They also did a rent deferral program for about 20 tenants on port property, which was fairly successful. They had a record-breaking kind of guest boater nights considering the shutdown early in the year. We also discussed the city's kind of projects of successes we've had, and then also projects we want to work on, Washington Park upgrades, camps, Meals on Wheels, things like that. The good thing is the port's big four kind of projects are down to just one, and it's the A-dock replacement, which should be done in May. I think a lot of people have seen the crazy machinery that's been out there. It's pretty exciting to watch and see that being upgraded because it's taken years to get to this point. The N Avenue Park, we talked a little bit about. We're really going to try as a port, a city, and the Samish tribe to kind of honor and work together these three entities so that it can have a well-rounded kind of history and experience for folks who go and visit that park. And then we talked a little bit about fiber. The port has benefited from our fiber project with regards to getting some pretty major tenants. I wasn't aware of that because I'm not on the fiber committee, but it was really exciting to hear that that was an asset to attract some really good businesses. So they were pleased that the city was so responsive and quick when it came to negotiations to help with that process, and that it's not just for our citizens with residential use, but it is also helping spur our economy. And then we just talked about kind of 2021 and how we're going to work together. But all in all, it was a really good, positive meeting, and we look forward to February.
Thank you, Christine. Any additions? All right, we'll move on then to the Personnel Committee report, item 2C.
You got it. Okay. I will continue talking. So that committee, I think I'm actually on all of them, but I'll be quiet after this one. So that was Councilmember Young and Councilmember McDougall. And we had a pretty robust discussion over 2 meetings. It was really beneficial. It was enjoyable. We got into the nitty-gritty. We asked a bunch of questions, and most of those questions will come up and be discussed later on in the agenda. So we really appreciate all of the work that Mr. Hoagland has done, kind of stepping in this element of not having an HR director and trying to kind of piece together. So I've no doubt we'll have a lot more to discuss, but we've tried to prep him for all the potential questions.
Great, thank you. And now we have item 2D, our Housing Affordability Community Service Committee report, and then Planning Committee, and usually you guys roll those together, so I'll just announce that.
Mayor Gear?
Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. The Housing Affordability and Community Services Committee met at 4 p.m. today with Councilmember Walters, Councilmember Cleland McGrath, and myself and staff. We talked about this year's cold weather shelter, which includes approximately $25,000 in motel vouchers, which are being used so people can be safe and warm during the cold season. And that is being administered by the Anacortes Family Center, so we are grateful to them for that. We talked about homelessness at Washington Park. There are some people who have been helped with funding to be there camping, and there are questions about having a transitional place for this part of our homeless population. especially as we move into spring and early season recreational camping starts. So staff is talking with the Family Center also on this potential project and talking about having an area at 22nd and R as a transitional place for people. These are beginnings of the conversations. There is a restroom nearby, and there could be power and water hooked up, and the Family Center would work to provide services to help people transition out of homelessness. So this would be a small number of people who have already been identified and who are at Washington Park, and how best to move forward to transition them into a housed place with the help of the Family Center. So there will be a community meeting and discussion about that, and then something will be coming to council, perhaps a resolution in the future. So that's being worked on. We also talked about our social services plan update, and that's ongoing. But what we're going to do first is our work plan for social services in our community that we have taken on with the 2021 budget. And our committee will work with staff on an inventory of services already existing and service providers in our community. And we will fill in those blanks, and then we will reach out to the community to be included in how we decide to move forward, how best to allocate that $50,000 most efficiently and most effectively. So it's going to be a great learning curve, and we're excited about the opportunity to do some real good with educating ourselves and each other and moving forward to increase those social services and bolster that network. I think that was it for housing affordability and community services.
All right, thank you. And then the planning committee,
Mayor Gear,
Ms. Moulton.
I'll just keep on rolling.
All right.
So we talked about the park impact fee that is being updated. There's been a study by Burt Consulting with park staff on updating our parks impact fees, which have been the same since 1998. So they are sorely in need of updating. And so there's a study that we've been presented with that we can review and compare to other park impact fees in other communities. There's a list of capital facilities projects. Anyway, it's actually really cool. So our committee is going to review it, as is the finance committee. You guys are up next on Wednesday, and then we'll bring what we've learned to council. So that's something that is overdue. So we will work on that. And then we talked also about adopting the 2018 International Building Codes, and that is coming forward on our agenda later on. So I don't really need to talk about that. As is, we also talked about well, no, that's the same. Sorry, that's it. Thank you.
All right, any other comments and any other reports? All right, at this time, we'll go to item 3. This is public comment. And if anyone in the public would like to speak to the council about anything not on the agenda, it's your opportunity to do so at this time, and you have 3 minutes. Nat, can you bring up that? And I do see one person with their hand up, and it looks like it's Rochelle. Welcome. All right, we're open for public comment. Go ahead.
Aloha, Mayor Gear and members of the City Council. I hope you guys are doing well tonight. I just wanted to say I love the transitional plan about rehousing identified houseless in our community. Sounds really great. This issue has been weighing heavily on my conscience, and it has to do with the health and well-being of every member of this community and every other person who passes through or has any connection to Anacortes. And a conversation I absolutely think is ridiculous to even have to bring up at this point in this pandemic, because we as a city should have already implemented some sort of enforcement just like every other caring city in the USA. I order my groceries mostly online, but I still have to go into local businesses, and I proudly support them. People in this town refuse to wear masks, whether I'm at the Econo Wash laundromat or confronting the owner of the Rosario Market for her blatant refusal to do the right thing and actually wear her mask or enforce simple mask policies. Or when at the Sunday protest watching people spread COVID while espousing their ignorance and loudly spreading their lung juice. My family has immunocompromised people in it, and it's disgusting how selfish members of our community still enjoy making a political statement forsaking the well-being of others around them. It's technically willful endangerment. What are we going to do as a city that says we care going forward? People not wearing masks see my disdain from my eyes up and always tell me that they are fine. They aren't sick. I don't need to worry about them. And I have to call them out on their selfish ignorance because most businesses don't. They mentioned to me that wearing a mask is so uncomfortable, they can't breathe. They are getting too much carbon, whatever they're going to call it. And they say maybe that's why I believe in the fake virus, because I have damaged my brain by wearing a mask. These are like actually nicer comments than most people make to me. I wore a mask 12 hours a day as a former healthcare worker and never once thought, oh, I can't breathe, unlike the Black and brown people extrajudicially murdered in this country. Nor has any other legitimate health worker on the front lines once said they can't breathe because they wear masks. Wearing masks suck. I, for instance, have developed maskne, but it's a tiny concession that's incredibly worth it. We as a country are number one in world deaths and cases with rounding 380,000 American dead and counting. More than 1 American dies every minute from COVID, with over 4,000 a day and rising. That's someone's uncle, mother, daughter, families that are being devastated. I never think or say this is infringing on my selfish American rights. I hate being decent and doing the right thing. I'm obviously mocking these people, but I support local small businesses, but they are spitting in my face by not following the mask mandates. I have made numerous complaints on Washington's Safe Start website, for the violations, but they are like overwhelmed and do nothing. Can we as a city pass something that holds these selfish humans accountable? I ask you as a city council, how much does it cost our city when our residents get and spread COVID? And that's just like what I'm wondering, and hopefully.
Thank you, Rochelle. Is there anyone else that would like to speak to us this evening? Any other member of the audience? Okay, thank you. We'll move on now to item 4, our consent agenda. 4A is the minutes of January 4th, 2021. Approval of claims in the amount of $920,874. A contract modification from Municipal Broadband Network, Library to the MSD aerial areas. Number D, contract award of intake pump station redundancy and resiliency study. And item 4E, a contract award for 2021 for janitorial services. Council, what is your pleasure?
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
I was going to move to that, but I forgot to mention that we did have a public safety meeting on Friday. It was just a quick one, but it's on the topic of 5A, primarily public safety met because it had to do with some of the fire codes that we'll discuss later. So we did have a public safety meeting on last Friday. But if I don't hear any further comments, I will move that we approve consent agenda items A through E.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any discussion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. We're now on to item 5 under other business. 5A is ordinance 3081. It's adopting the 2018 International Building Codes. This is a discussion with possible action, and it is open for public comment. Mr. Miesemer, welcome.
Thank you, Mayor, and council members, members of the audience. I would first like to recognize that we have with us, in case there are questions I can't answer, Mr. Rob Freisinker, who is our building code plans examiner for the city of Anacortes. He does a great job for the city. So the adoption of ordinance 3081 would amend Anacortes Municipal Code, chapter 19.14, adopting the current international 28 codes consistent with the Washington State Building Code Council, along with the state amendments. The anticipated effective date for the codes was originally July 1, 2020. Then due to COVID, the governor issued proclamation extending this date to November 1, and then extended by the state again by the Building Code Council to February 1, 2020. As of late January 8th, last Friday, the State Building Code Council voted to delay implementation of the 2018 codes to July 1, 2021, based on concerns from the building industry and continued struggles with COVID-19. Ordinance 3081 does include a local amendment beyond those that are typically adopted with the international codes, and that is to require an automatic fire sprinkler system in all structures 3,000 square foot or more. So typically, a fire sprinkler system would be required in a structure, whether it's residential or commercial, based on size and fire flow, access, or the lack of access. And Mr. Kennedy is available this afternoon or this evening as well to help answer some questions on that. We've received several emails objecting to the fire sprinkler proposal as it stands at 3,600 square feet. Although there have been other, several emails as well that say, well, maybe that threshold should be somewhere around 4,800. And those have all been transmitted to the council. Ms. Moulton brought up a couple of areas in the ordinance that we kind of bypassed by, and but since then have amended and revised them. And that is where originally our code sent appeals and alternate materials and methods to the Board of Adjustment. Those would now go to the hearings examiner for each. And like I say, those sections have been changed. Mr. Walters also brought up a small one that we will revise as needed. So a couple of things that bear, I think, some discussion and conversation. And that is one, perhaps does the council want to consider putting this off until about May to correspond with the rest of the jurisdictions in the state, or go ahead and look at adopting it within the next month here. The other is the fire sprinkler system issue, and that's one where several people are quite concerned about the costs that would be incurred with new building construction. A fire sprinkler system in a 3,600 square foot single family residence can run between $8,000 and $10,000. So with that, perhaps it'd be a good idea for Mayor, with your, of course, authorization, perhaps Mr. Kennedy could talk a little bit about the purpose of requiring a fire sprinkler system for buildings 3,600 and larger.
Okay, so Chief Kennedy, you want to take that?
Thank you, Mayor. Council members, thank you very much. So the purpose for adding this in as a local amendment is based on primarily on our current staffing levels for fire protection within the city of Anacortes. The fire department currently runs 3 ALS ambulances, and then we also have 3 fire engines, but we only have staff to do one or the other. So if the call comes in and it's a medical call, they jump on the ambulance. If it's a fire call, they jump on the engine and respond. So when we respond to the scene of a working fire, when we get on scene with a minimum of 2 people, we are unable to effect what's called an imminent rescue. State law prohibits us from entering a structure unless we have 2 people outside the building for the first 2 people going in. There is a exception to that. It's a very strict exception for imminent rescue, where we know 100% that there is somebody in the building that can be rescued. And in that case, we can go in with 2 people if we have 1 person on the outside. So currently, with our current staffing, we have to wait until an additional fire engine gets on scene before we have enough staff to effect that rescue. What we've been seeing over the past several years is an increase in the number of our medical calls to where it is not uncommon at all for us to have 2, 3, or 4 calls happening simultaneously. In those cases, we have to wait for resources to come from neighboring jurisdictions, and that does not allow us the time to enter and actually perform any firefighting or life-saving activities in a timely manner. What the National Fire Protection recommends is 12 firefighters within 12 minutes 90% of the time, which is also what our standard of cover is designed to give us, and we just do not have enough people to meet that. So the reason we're asking for the sprinkler amendment is to take the prevention side and actually get the fires knocked down or allow additional time for the occupants to escape under their own power before we even get there. And that's basically the impetus for why we've asked for this amendment.
Okay. So council, questions of Chief Kennedy.
Mayor Gear,
Mr. Carter.
I was wondering, what is the temperature required to set off the fire sprinkler system? And at what temperature is it lethal to someone inside?
The temperature for a residential sprinkler typically activates at 155 degrees. For the temperature to be fatal, that depends on where they're at. As you know, heat rises. Typically in a working fire, the temperatures reach about 2,000 degrees at the ceiling and then work their way down. And where most people are standing up, those temperatures are going to be 500 to 600 minimum, and that does not, they would become unconscious immediately. And then the other part is the smoke that is generated from fires, which is what actually kills most people, is smoke inhalation, which goes all the way down to the floor.
So it's realistic that the sprinkler system would go off a lot sooner before it gets too lethal for someone to be in there.
That is correct, and that is what they are designed to do, is actually when the first head goes off at the lower temperature, is it puts out the fire or severely knocks it down.
Thank you.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Mr. Young.
Chief, first of all, thank you for the work you do. I know you work incredibly hard, and you've always come before council superbly prepared. So I'm hoping I won't throw you a curveball with this one, but what it seems like we're discussing here is current staffing versus a new requirement. And what we're saying is that the current staffing that we have is not enough to meet these new demands as they continue to increase, because we've got an increase in medical calls taking up even more of the time itself. Is that, am I?
It is.
Okay, all right. So I still see those two things as still being a little different, in the sense that I agree some additional regulation would seem to be necessary, but personally, I think if we were to wait a bit, as Mr. Miesemer said, and see where we are in all of this, it might be helpful. Because what I wouldn't want to do is to write in legislation because we already don't have enough staffing. Staffing would seem to be an issue that we really need to confront, making sure that you have all the staff, or at least adequate staff, to meet the demands and the needs of the city. So those for me are two different things, and I wouldn't want to move forward tonight without further explaining that or researching that, because again, I think there are two very different issues. I just think your staffing needs is one thing, but if we believe we will never be able to address those things and we have no other choice, then we could do that. But again, this would either require buildings getting a retrofit, or they would be simply for buildings going forward.
The intention of this is not to be retroactive. It is just for new construction moving forward. But I totally agree with your explanation of it. They are two different issues. They are related, but they are two separate issues. And what the goal would be to be able to conduct an imminent rescue. And that would be putting 3 firefighters on scene immediately with the safety backup to effect that rescue.
I totally get that. One more question on this too is that given that, and I know you may not be able to assess that for us here, but I'm just trying to make sure that we don't have those occurrences where we don't have enough staff, we don't have enough, people in place, but I think your role is to juggle those things. So I would love to look at how we can help you have the team that you need, and then also look at how we can make a move for sprinklers that would not be in reaction to your need for staffing. You got it? So those are the two things I'm wrestling with, and we'll listen from other council members tonight as the discussion goes forward. Thank you. Thank you, Chief.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Walters.
I think that there are at least 2 issues here. The first being whether we want to adopt the building code ahead of the rest of the state. I think that we should not do that. I think it's useful for at least all the jurisdictions in Skagit County, but also the greater region, to have the same building code, which is why the state has its own building code. And imposes that building code on all the different jurisdictions. So I don't think that we should be ahead of the date set by the State Building Code Council. We could adopt now with an effective date of later, but I'm not sure that we should do that either, because this date has been pushed a couple of times now, and that could happen again. So I don't think that we should plan to adopt tonight, regardless of the discussion about the sprinklers. I do think that we should engage in that discussion though. And one of the things we talked about in our planning committee meeting is that it would help us to have more information from the fire department and potentially the planning department too about the cost of this change. We have gotten some public comments on this, and I think that we need to accumulate those and make sure that council gets to see all of them. But sprinklers are, I think, unquestionably a good thing. It's just, what is the cost on development? Who is most readily able to pay, and what are the appropriate thresholds? The state building code sets some thresholds for us, and the international code does. So if we're going to deviate from those, which I think is appropriate for a jurisdiction that we're fairly spread out, it takes a certain amount of time to get between portions of town because of our geography. I mean, there's some real reasons that we might want to do this. But we need to carefully consider them. I think we'll need to take additional input from the development community as well.
Mayor here.
Walters. Mr. Miller.
Mr. Walters makes all valid points, and I agree that we should not be out of line with the state code, and we should hold off for the overall code. We did have a pretty good discussion at the public safety meeting on the sprinkler code. And the one thing that's common with staffing and sprinklers, and really all fire safety, is risk analysis. And typically, if we're lucky, we have 6 firefighters on duty any 24-hour period, because we have 3 fire stations. Knowing that we have a minimum of 6 on staff. Maybe on on certain times, and I know Chief Kennedy will correct me on that, but having 12 firefighters show up is almost an impossibility from a staffing perspective. So therefore, now you got to go with the risk analysis. But you also have to balance that with the cost analysis. We all know that we're having trouble with affordable housing in Anacortes, especially when you talk about, don't think about the McMansion of a 5,000 square foot house that, yeah, okay, they can probably afford it. Think about the triplex where you've got some affordable housing in there, and that's going to dramatically raise the cost of that and make it very difficult to solve one of the issues we know we have in the community. So to make my point a little shorter, I'm probably not on board with I'm certainly not on board with the 3,600 square foot requirement, but I suggested a 5,000 square foot. But Chief Kennedy's talked about fire flow or water flows, which is how they measure stuff, and convinced me that a 4,800 foot is the next threshold for water flow. So that's something that, again, I don't think we should adopt this tonight, but that's something I would suggest other council members think about in this risk analysis discussion, whether, okay, 4,800 might be a better number than the staff proposed 3,600 square foot number. Thank you.
Madam Mayor?
Yes, Mr. Chief Kennedy.
I appreciate the comment of Mr. Walters, Mr. Young, and Mr. Miller, as it is very valid. I would like to point out one clarification. In the model fire code, the code actually requires that all residential be fire sprinklered. The State Building Code Council has, at the state level in their amendments, removed that out of the model code since the 2012 adoption and left that up to individual jurisdictions either to leave out or approve. So I just wanted to make that slight clarification.
Thank you.
Mayor Gear.
Ms. Cleland McGrath.
Yeah, oh, and thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Kennedy. I think that's an important thing to realize, that that international code has said that this should be across the board, and the state has decided that they want different municipalities to kind of determine what is best for them. I guess a couple of points to just expand upon what's already been said, and I agree with, is that we're not only talking about residential, but we're also talking about commercial buildings. And so that is an even larger, at least to me, seems like a larger jump to go from 12,000 square feet for commercial building, which would require sprinklers, down to that 3,600 or 4,800 threshold. And what I guess moving forward is I need more, or I would appreciate more information as to the costs involved and then the ongoing cost of maintenance for those buildings. It's my understanding that, if someone builds a shell building, then when a tenant comes to be approved to use the building, then the sprinkler system or whatever fire protection is required is then determined based on their use. And that to me seems pretty reasonable. But we've also had in some of our committee discussions that it's much more cost effective to do it up front when the building is being built. And then it can be modified based on tenant. So I would like some more information about that. The other point that I think is important for council to be aware of when we talk about that 3,600 or 4,800 square foot threshold, that includes attached garages in our square footage. That includes accessory dwelling units that are attached to the main living, the main living space. So when we're talking about kind of the fact that we need to diversify our housing stock, we need to make sure we're not talking about each individual requirement for construction separately, right? And I don't think anyone would disagree that if we can have sprinklers everywhere and cost is not an issue, that I'd be all for having sprinklers. But knowing that it is kind of that one more hurdle to get over when we talk about price per square foot, when we talk about resale, because new construction doesn't live in a bubble. When we have the construction costs be one thing, new construction, that does impact existing home prices. So when we're talking about affordable, that can be a challenge. And then the fact that we're trying to encourage duplexes and triplexes because they fit within our residential neighborhoods pretty easily. I want some of these issues to be considered and also get feedback from the community about them. And then finally, I think Mr. Young really hit it on the head. It's a service element, right? When we're having 80%, I think is what you mentioned, and I could be incorrect or off, are medic calls versus fire calls, right? And new construction already has a lot of, fire code for construction and installation and whatnot to slow the spread of a fire built into those international building codes. So, those newer builds, is that really going to address the problem of all of our older construction homes that are more likely to catch fire and spread quickly? What we may really need is not necessarily increasing the cost of new construction, but making sure that we figure out a way to have 3-man teams. And I would like you to weigh in, I mean, not right now, but consider that and weigh in your opinion if that's really a better use of our funds and resources and would better serve our community across the board. So that's, if you have time, I know you're super busy, but I would appreciate kind of having that additional information before we make our final decision.
Mayor.
Mr. McDougall, then Ms. Moulton.
Okay. Actually, really quickly, I thought Mrs. McGrath made a great point about newer builds and features that are at least helpful in mitigating fire. And I was curious if do we have data on fire calls and say construction date of the structures involved?
Not to my knowledge. I could look around to see if we could get some along those lines, but I'm not aware of any sources where that is tied together. I might be able to pull something out of the national statistics, but we don't have anything for Anacortes itself.
Okay, got it. Yeah, if like I wouldn't spend a bunch of time on it, but if we could come up with even a sample just to get a sense for, within stuff built in the last 20 years, like what are the sort of relative share of number of fire calls versus stuff in the previous 20 or 30 or 50 or whatever.
Okay, I will work on something for that.
Thank you.
Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. Chief Kennedy, you spoke briefly about the increase in medical calls and the high percentage of them. I think you might have said 80 to 85%. Could you talk a little bit about that increase recently? Is it tied to per capita growth, or I just would like to know a little bit more about that, if you have that information at hand.
I don't have that directly with me. I do have some of that in the office. What I can say is that we are seeing an increase per capita as we have more residents moving in. We also are seeing a lot more EMS 911 calls now, where with the COVID, when it first started, we were seeing a decrease because people were staying home, not getting out as much, not getting sick. Then come summertime, when things started relaxing a little bit, then it started picking up with the vengeance again. And the last 6 months of this year have been extremely busy. And one of the things that we're seeing as well is people are afraid now to go to the doctor or to the hospital, or they're not able to do so in a timely manner. So they're using the 911 pre-hospital system in lieu of that. So I think there's a lot of separate factors that are contributing to the increased numbers.
Wow, that's helpful. Thank you for that information.
Hey, Gear.
Mr. Young.
I guess I want to just kind of throw this out to you and council as well as chief and others. I think that would be beneficial to the city if we expanded our data keeping just a little bit more so that we can disaggregately break out, what's taking place, let's say COVID versus one thing or another, and it will allow us to extrapolate what's taking place, what truly the needs are, because if we're having a need that's really, our increase is really all about COVID, that also would help us make determination in the chief about staffing needs, particularly because 80 to 85% is, maybe COVID, or 80 to 85% may be something that we can address. And it allows us to surgically address the issue. And I think it would benefit our city if we just, not anything too elaborate, but if we could sort of have a little bit more detail, or the departments began collecting a bit more detail, it will allow us as a city to better be able to react far more efficiently, I think. So I'd like to just put that out there for consideration. Thank you.
Mayor Gare?
Ms. Moulton.
Thank you. One more thing, Chief Kennedy, that we talked briefly about in our planning committee meeting was the decrease in volunteers that are available over the years. And I'm not sure what to do about that, but I think it would be wonderful if we did have more, and if there are ways that we can increase our roster of volunteers, that would help greatly too. And I don't even know where to start, but you might have some ideas about that.
I can tell you that we did make a very pointed program about 2 years ago to increase the number of our volunteer firefighters. We actually brought somebody in on contract that was actually out advertising and marketing for volunteers within the city. We did have a limited amount of success with that. And then again, went back to the same thing that we've been seeing over the past several years. The typical volunteer now, instead of somebody that already has a career and they are doing the firefighting on the side, now what we see is the younger men and women that are just getting out of high school that are looking for a career in the fire service. So we bring them in, we get them oriented, we get them trained to the firefighter 1, firefighter 2 level, and then they go off and get a job as a career firefighter somewhere else. And that's what we're seeing now as the typical model volunteer. And it's just hard to keep a good firefighting force on the volunteer side when they go get jobs elsewhere on us.
Okay. So at this time, is there anyone in the audience who would like to talk to the council about this issue? Okay, no one's raised their hand. So I've heard a couple things tonight. We don't want to move too quickly. We want to be in accordance with the rest of the cities in the county. So, and we do have a little more time. So Don, are you suggesting in the May, June time period for adoption?
Yes, Mayor. I think we can, first of all, with Mr. Kennedy, we could put together some more information, come back in about a month or so and talk more about the sprinkler system, and then look at implementation sometime in May, June, unless the State Building Code Council pushes it out a little more.
Yeah. And then on a parallel path, continue the discussion with public safety on how we address meeting the criteria for when we do have an imminent rescue in a building and how we navigate that in the city. And so it looks to me like we have two issues that, you know, they can help each other, but that, you know, there definitely are separate issues also. But I appreciate Chief Kennedy bringing this forward and pointing out, you know, what the model fire code is and how the state's deviated. And, you know, we live in a really geographically interesting community and we're really spread out. So there's a lot of factors. So any other thing that we want to put on the plate tonight? Questions, thoughts for staff to bring forward? Okay, so we'll bring this forward in a month or two and we'll get some questions answered and we'll continue discussing things also in public safety. All right, and thank you, Rob, for attending. I appreciate you just being with us. So at this time, we're going to move on to the next item on our agenda. It is item 5B. And this is Resolution 3012, And this is the city's leave policy regarding COVID-19 related absences. This is a discussion with possible action this evening. Mr. Hoagland.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council, and members of the audience. As was mentioned earlier in the meeting, we had a couple of committee meetings last week. They were super interesting, very lively, and I wanted to share some of that and introduce a discussion topic on the COVID benefits. So what we're talking about here Okay, so what we're talking about is the expanded leave benefits that were put into place to deal with COVID-related absences. And those were leave requirements that the federal government mandated. And that was brought about in March of 2020 through the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, the FFCRA. And that was put into place effective through the end of the year, December 31st, 2020. And that required employers with less than 500 employees to provide 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave, EPSL, and it also required the expanded use of FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, to allow employees to take leave to care for loved ones affected by COVID-19. And additionally, it required FMLA to be paid at either 2/3 or full pay, depending on the reason. There was a half dozen or so criteria that were listed in the FFCRA. And then in response to that, or in addition to that, the city actually adopted a policy to provide full pay for those FMLA absences regardless. So it was the full pay option for the city of Anacortes, not at 2/3. And that city policy in response to the FFCRA, that was dated April 1st, 2020 through the end of the year, and was included in the packet material that went out today. I apologize for the late notice on that packet material. So those leave benefits, as I said, they were set to expire December 31st. Well, on December 27th of 2020, HR 133 was signed by the president, which provided some additional coronavirus relief for next year, well, for this year now, for 2021. However, the expanded leave requirements were not extended beyond the end of the year. So I guess I, for one, maybe foolishly, I don't know, but I, for one, was expecting at least some of those leave requirements to be extended. So we were caught a little bit flat-footed, but we, I think, we responded pretty well. As I said last week, had 2 meetings with the Personnel Committee. I appreciate their ability to respond quickly and try and address this. So the 2 types of leave that we're talking about, again, the 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave, the EPSL, we had 56 staff that used at least some of those 80 hours. We actually had 68 staff that filled out the paperwork for it. 56 staff used at least some of those hours, and 16 staff exhausted the full 80 hours. Total of 2,363 of those hours were used in 2020. And of the expanded Family Medical Leave Act option, we had 2 employees that used some of this leave. And that was, the FMLA provides up to 12 weeks of leave. So between those 2 employees, that would have been a total possible 960 hours. There were 301 hours of that FMLA used last year. So as I said, the late timing of the current bill did not really allow sufficient time to prepare alternative city policies before year end. We met twice last week. And additionally, we sent an email out. There's an HR distribution list to a number of local government HR officials. And we sent an email out to see what other entities were doing. And we got a response from some number, but this is what some of the other entities in the area are doing. And as I said, it was a big distribution list, and we didn't get a response from everybody, certainly, but we got some number of responses. So Whatcom County is doing nothing. They're just reverting back to what their existing personnel policies dictated that their leave could be used for. Alderwood Water and Wastewater District, they left the 80 hours of EPSL that was in place. They left that balance in place for employees to draw on. Skagit PUD is providing 40 additional hours of EPSL. Island County adjusted their city leave policies to allow their employee sick leave to be used for COVID. Port of Bellingham extended all of those FFCRA provisions through March 31st. Skagit County is not doing an extension, but they do have a voluntary furlough program in place where the county is continuing to pay benefits of anybody participating in that furlough program. City of Bellingham adjusted their employee policies to allow their employee leave to be used for COVID. City of Mount Vernon is not taking any action, reverting back to their existing policies. WTA, Wacom Transit, they're extending those FFCRA provisions through March 31st. And Port of Anacortes is also extending the FFCRA provisions. So a couple of things that all of the committee members agreed on, at least generally. So there was 3 items that at least there was some general agreement on, and that was the committee members felt like it made sense to clarify that city sick leave, that city employee sick leave would be allowable for COVID-19 related absences. And then they also agreed that providing some number of additional EPSL hours made sense, and then also identifying an end date for those additional benefits. So the first one, the adjusting or confirming that city sick leave be allowable for COVID-19 related absences. I pulled these 6 criteria off of an article I read about the FFCRA, and most of it is kind of, pretty intuitive. If the employee is subject to federal, state, or local quarantine, if you're advised to quarantine, if you're experiencing symptoms, caring for somebody who's in quarantine. I think number 5 here, in my mind at least, is the biggest change that I wanted to ensure that would be clarified for our employees, that caring for a son or daughter, essentially caring for a loved one, and the child's school or place of care has been closed or the child care provider is unavailable. So nobody is specifically ill in this case, but because of COVID, there's no place for those loved ones to go. So the parent is staying home with them. And then number 6, experiencing any other substantially similar condition. That seems extra. It probably just muddies the water, so sorry about that. So the additional EPSL, this was another interesting talking point that we had a lively debate about. Where we landed at the end of the meeting was an additional 40 hours of emergency paid sick leave be made available to city staff for use meeting the FFCRA criteria. So that those 80 hours that were initially provided through in March that expired December 31st. So that leave bank is gone. And this would be 40 hours starting over. Each employee have available for COVID related absences. And it would be allocated on a FTE basis. So if you were half-time employee, you'd get 20 hours, quarter FTE would get 10 hours, et cetera. And it would be in addition to the existing employee balances. And then the last part, those criteria having an end date, and December 31st, 2021 is what the committee considered for those criteria to lapse. So I will say.
Go ahead. I'll ask when you're done.
I was going to point out this point here of the additional EPSL for staff. That was a lively discussion. We had some committee members who wanted to provide 80 hours of EPSL. We had some committee members who felt that employees should be required to use some of their own leave before dipping into that new bank, essentially to have some skin in the game, if you will. And that's Yeah, that's what I was going to say about that.
So isn't one of the issues that the COVID leave was paid from CARES funding last year?
Right. So thank you, Mary.
Available now.
Correct. That CARES grant that we had, those COVID hours, we were able to apply for reimbursement from the CARES Act grant that the city received. I think it was either 620 or 680,000. So all of those hours we captured through our payroll system and received reimbursement from that CARES grant.
Mayor Gear,
Mr. Walters.
have we now spent all that money?
Yes, indeed. We exhausted all of that grant and then some. Yep.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
So along that same line, I'm trying to get an estimate of what the cost would be of doing the additional 40 hours, if you could extrapolate based on current employees that have used it and how much we spent previously.
Yes, that's a good question. So I did, if you'd allow me a moment, I do have some information. I did pull some information together. I don't have it on my desktop though. I'd have to dig for it for a minute.
Well, since I'm still, Mayor, since you still are letting me talk, first of all, thank you. I am, until we capture what the cost might be, I'm not going to get behind this as of yet. I do support the one aspect of it, allowing COVID-19 issues to be used for employees to take sick leave. I don't support going to the end of the next year. Maybe something middle, something like March, like some of the other cities. But overall, I'm pretty skeptical of a lot of the aspects, with the exception of using COVID, the points that Mr. Hoagland put up, those 6 reasons to be able to use sick leave. Again, I'm just thinking, a lot of the private businesses in Anacortes that have gone under would sure love to have these type of things to bail them out. And it's kind of time to start thinking about recovery rather than how to keep hiding. Again, I know it's hard on everybody, but that's where I am on this.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Young.
Mr. Hoagland, it was a wonderful discussion. I mean, we really did look at it in the committee from all angles. And what we really tried to determine was what we thought was, fair, but also at the same time provide a safety net for those, staff and teams that were, may come up with COVID or one other thing. And that was the reason the expanded use of their personal leave came into place. Mr. Hoagland, I think in one of the documents or one of the notes that you forwarded back, and it could have been to a question Ms. Cleland McGrath had asked, but wasn't there an average 300 and something hours, maybe I read that wrong, for the employees in their personal leave?
Yes, that's right. So, and that's what I was looking for.
Yeah, I saw it. It was great analysis. And I think, so they do have, on average, 300 and something hours in their personal leave, if we could find a way for them to be able to use that. In addition, would be great because that allows that flexibility. But then also one of the things that came out in the discussion was that we still also have the pool for employees. It still does not eliminate if an employee needs a FLMA leave, it still doesn't eliminate that. And there's also another program by Washington. So I guess the argument is there are any number of programs that can help an employee, and that even if someone reaches the end of that rope and really need it, there's also a mechanism within the city to be able to allocate part of your personal time that you've accumulated to that employee. So there was a lot of ways to do it. And so the discussion was really centering around, did we want to provide some additional hours? What that would be, whether it would be 0, 40, 80. And then, so that was the lively discussion. And so we thought we'd bring that to council for us to work on those pieces. Thank you.
So as Mr. Young mentioned, we did a little research. So the average employee sick leave balance is 325 hours. And it's interesting because it's not a bell-shaped curve. 1/3 of employees have more than that. 2/3 of employees have less than that. But that is the average. And maybe it was this, Mr. Miller. I don't know if this is answering your. I don't know if this will answer your question or not. But the total number of hours used during the year was 2,363, and that was by 56 staff. Sorry, I thought I'd share that. So that was 2,363 hours used by 56 staff members.
Mayor Gear.
Yes, Ms. Cleland.
Yeah, so we did have a lively debate and I actually really enjoyed it. But just to kind of hit a couple points that were brought up so far, you know, it seemed from talking to Mr. Hoagland and kind of the finance accounting that a lot of people were using not full days or weeks at a time, but were using it to fill in when there was half days and things like that, just because of working from home and trying to do that balance. So this wasn't a situation where people were taking a week off and work wasn't getting done, but it was a way to accommodate a very unique situation with COVID. Talking about, we had a really robust discussion of, do you just extend what began March of 2020 into 2021? Do you reset? What about the folks that have exhausted it or not used it? And it seemed like we talked round and round, but we were really trying to keep whatever benefit we were going to provide as clean as possible for accounting purposes, for dealing with various union contracts and things like that. And so that's why we kind of got to the conclusion of some set hours, and I think the proposal was 40. I agree with Mr. Miller about we need to get back into a recovery mode. But at least for myself, when I've gone through kind of that Washington questionnaire of when I will get the vaccine, it's anywhere from July to December. So while we're starting to see the vaccine roll out, I think we need to be aware that there could be exposures happening for our workforce through the end of December. Resetting that clock at March, or having it end at March kind of complicated things versus just going through the end of the year. If someone exhausts it and then we have to add time on, do we also add, or if we extend the time period, do we also have to then add on days to kind of make it right? Another one is, we've exhausted CARES funding, but there is talk that we may get more funding with the new federal administration. So obviously they would account for any hours that were related to COVID that was taken. A couple other things, just, school's back in session as of this week, but I know that there are some pretty strict guidelines. So if a child is sick or says they feel ill, they're asked a series of questions. If they answer 2 in the affirmative, they are sent home for 10 days, no questions asked. So I don't think, while we've got this rollout of vaccines, which is wonderful, and hopefully we can get back to that, I'm not sure it's realistic to think that we're not going to have some of the COVID exposures and quarantine times still occurring. So that's kind of what I wanted to get out there for our discussion. And then finally, when Mr. Young made a good point how employees, if they've exhausted all of their sick days, other employees can donate to their fund of sick days. They have to be actual vacation days, and it has to be approved by the mayor. So it's a little bit more complicated than just here's some sick days, right? So I think it was a really kind of complicated discussion because these are our employees and these are human beings, and it's a pretty challenging time. So trying to keep it as like straightforward and simple as possible, knowing that a lot of folks do have quite a few vacation days, but also trying to give at least those that might not have as many kind of some buffer to make long-term plans.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
So, Mr. Hoagland, so is the expectation about 2,300 hours in the next year? I mean, I'm trying to capture some sort of cost. I mean, it's great to assume that the federal government's going to bail us out again, but we have to take care of what we know, and is that the estimation of cost?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. I think there's a number of staff now have, the majority of our staff are working at home, as probably the majority of all staff are working at home. And I know that there are a number of parents who have kind of figured out how to tag team with their spouse so that, one of them works during the day, one of them works at night, and they can trade off. So I don't necessarily expect to see the number that high again,
Well, that's I don't feel like we've done the deep dive on looking at our city employees who or have to come in physically to work versus the ones that I think it might be a little easier to balance the major challenge. One of the major challenges, which the other council members brought up, with kids being sent home from school. That's a major challenge if you are a city employee that has to physically be at work. So I feel like we need to flesh that out a little more.
Okay. So, yes, Mr. Walters.
One thing that I haven't heard mentioned is that I think it's pretty important that we do not incentivize employees to come to work when they've had a COVID exposure. I don't necessarily know that giving unlimited amounts of sick time is the right approach to ensure that incentive isn't created. If 80 is the magic number, but we don't have agreement on that, I wonder if we might consider 40 hours through the first 6 months of this year or something like that. But I do think it's important. I think Ms. Cleland McGrath's point is well taken. This could be with us still for a very long time. The exposure problem is going to be with us even after the vaccine is available. It's not 100%, and it's not going to be 100% distributed. So I'd be perfectly willing to move a little slower, as Mr. Miller suggests, and plan for the first 6 months of this year, and not plan for the full year, assuming that doesn't create substantial difficulties in accounting for this sick leave bank.
Mayor Gear?
Mr. Young.
Part of the reason for bringing forward this part of the discussion to council is that we knew that each of you would have some great points to bring forward, because I would tell you the truth, the three of us, Christine and Bruce, we went from the gauntlet and did the analysis to try to figure out how we bring this forward. And so I'm on the leaner side with the two of you. But I do want to, I think we should have the discussion about what if it's 0 hours or 40 hours or 80 hours. I happen to be 40 hours, or I think 40 hours across the board. But what I want to make sure we do is that we allow that not just for parents with kids, because sometimes there are people who don't have kids, but they're also caring for loved ones that with COVID exposure, they are also should have an option in these 6 options here to be able to apply just like everyone else too, when they're sick. So I want to make sure that that's in there. Thank you.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. McDougall.
I want to say the least versed on these issues as far as compared to my colleagues on the personnel committee. So it was a great discussion and I learned a lot myself. And I'm kind of intrigued by the idea. Originally, I was kind of I was one of the ones pushing for 80 hours in coverage through the calendar year. But I am kind of intrigued by the idea of maybe going 6 months, say 40 hours and go 6 months. And then, in April, May, we look at it and see if we need to extend it through the year. And maybe it's 20 hours instead of another 40 hours or something like that. But we'll have more data by then. We'll have a better sense, to Mr. Miller's point, a better sense to like, are the hours, following a similar pattern to 2020, or are they, is it a better pattern, something like that? If that doesn't create too much of a mess for accounting, as Mr. Walters suggests.
Mr. Walters.
And there's another thing I was thinking of. If someone actually has an exposure or actually ends up with COVID, they're going to really quickly use up their 40 hours and probably their 80 hours and be digging into their existing leave bank. If it is simply a matter of caring for their kids because their schools are closed, that is almost an unlimited amount of time that the employee needs, and we can't give that. So we could distinguish between those 2 classes of scenario where you actually have an exposure or you actually have the disease, versus where you need some additional time for childcare.
Mayor Gear.
Miller.
Yeah, I mean, I think what some other cities have done is something like a leave of absence where it's not paid sick leave. And so I'm open to that. And that leads to my suggestion is, I know it's impactful because we're already into 2021 and it's impacting our employees now, but I think maybe another week to take a look at that and look at this and try to answer a couple more questions about, because again, I don't think 80 hours would necessarily cover somebody who maybe had a COVID infection, go rampant in their family. That's not enough. They might need a leave of absence, but also we might not be able to afford that. We can't afford that actually, but to be able to bring an employee back after a leave of absence, I think other cities have looked at that. So again, I think we should take a little more time, or give staff a little more time to take a look at this, because I can tell that staff doesn't have enough time when we don't get the packet right away. That's usually a good clue that we need a little bit more time to take a look at it.
Yeah. So why don't we take one more week? What else do you need, Mr. Hoagland, to bring to us?
Yeah, thank you. So, and I really do apologize for the timing. It's really awkward. But we are approaching the end of our first pay period for 2021. So I was thinking perhaps, here, let me share this.
Can I say one thing, Mayor Gear? So when talking about an unpaid leave, we do have the FMLA, right, which was in existence prior to COVID. It's just 12 weeks of unpaid leave while still holding your position, and that still is in existence. The real difference between the bill that was passed in March of 2020 that expired in December is that the federal government required employees to be paid at either at least 2/3 of their income. So that's still an option, even though they can exhaust. I assume they can still exhaust their sick pay, but still hold their position within the city if they need to use that full 12 weeks.
And Mayor Garrett, could I add one thing to what Ms. Cleland McGrath has added?
Of course.
There's also, I'd like for Mr. Hoagland, if possible, because the committee went through all of the options, there was an additional option, meaning the Washington Paid Sick Leave Program. I think it would be beneficial to council if we had a listing of the available programs. I know they may be onerous to get in some of them, but it gives us options to consider, FMLA, or whether we assign some additional hours, or the pooling of employees being able to donate a vacation day. Thank you, Ms. Cleveland McGrath, for that clarity. And other things, I think it'll be interesting for us to see what are the options, and if in what we were attempting to do, it really added any benefit, or there are options for the employee to be able to use. The only thing that I'm asking that we add to the possibility of COVID-19 leave benefits is that where we have number 5, caring for a son or daughter or child's school, I think we need to also expand that for a parent or relative, because sometimes there are people who are the primary caregiver for a parent or relative who has COVID, and given the senior center is not an option as it once was, I just don't want us to not make it available to other people who may be affected by COVID differently than just children. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor Gear. Hey, Mr. Young, yeah, I brought up in our email discussion that item number 6 of experiencing other substantially similar condition. So to me, after looking at all the options, to me that really applies to adult dependents, whether they be parents or
Perfect.
right, spouses or whatnot,
Yeah.
that would otherwise have a social network but is closed because of COVID. And it was vague to me, which is why I pointed it out to our committee. But if that's the intent, that makes a lot of sense now.
Good. Okay. Do you think that it would benefit us if we were to sort of clear up the language a little bit so we know what it is? I know the team and the staff will know, but I just want that language to be just maybe a little clearer.
Okay.
I agree. Thank you.
Any other words from Mr. Hoagland so we can bring this back next week?
So Mayor, if I may, I guess I was thinking, since we need to sign timesheets this Friday, perhaps this resolution, if council was agreeable, we could make those modifications that were described to section 1, and then section 2 is where the discussion for an additional EPSL bank was. If we remove this, put that onto a different resolution, so at least it was clear that if employees needed to take COVID-related time off to watch over take care of a loved one, they could use their existing sick leave for that. Does that kind of make sense? Is that?
Yep. Do we
Okay.
have a head nod from the council on that? Okay. We got a head nod for that, Steve.
So for number 5, I guess if would council prefer me to reword that to include, instead of saying a child, just refer to a loved one, or is it sufficient to leave it as is and then leave number 6 in there as to kind of bolster that that list?
Here.
Mr. Walters.
I think number 5 is pretty related directly to childcare and schools and children. And I think 6 really captures that, as Ms. Cleveland McGrath mentioned, a substantially similar condition.
And
So-
maybe could you add family member to that?
So I guess my proposal is to not add family member,
Okay.
because it's
All right.
substantially similar.
Okay.
If
All right.
a child care provider, if we want to do family member that is suffering from COVID, do we have that in here? Yeah, number 4.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's a family member who cannot be by themselves, other than a child, what particular situation would that be?
Well, so as we're talking about this, I know of at least one circumstance in the city where that's taking place, and I think it probably fell under this number 6, because it wasn't a child, but it was somebody that needed care and didn't have an alternative because of COVID.
Because of COVID. Okay. Yeah, so substantial is similar to 5. So consistent with Mr. Hoagland's recommendation then, I move that we adopt the resolution as presented with deletion of section 2, which we'll consider later.
Second.
Okay, excellent.
Okay, well, I've heard some okays, but I haven't heard a second.
Mayor Garrett, I seconded that.
Oh, you did? Okay, I didn't hear that. So we have a motion by Mr. Walters, a second by Ms. Cleland. Ms. Hunt, can you read back to us what that motion is? And we'll take a vote.
The motion, can you hear me?
Yep.
The motion is to adopt resolution 3012 as presented, except for we will delete section 2 entirely from that resolution and consider that separately later.
Mayor Gear.
Mr. Miller.
And in section 2, because again, I'm having trouble pulling it up electronically. Is that the date and the hours? Thank you.
Okay. All right, Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
Wait, Mayor Garrett. So does the one question I had, and it came up in our committee discussion, do we want section 1 to expire at the end of December 31st, 2021? Or do we want this to be ongoing? Because that will affect the kind of the manual, right, for staff. And I was a little concerned if we want to do that, or if we just want it to go through December 31st, 2021, and at that point we can reassess.
Here.
Mr. Walters.
Since we're only adopting section 1, and section 1 simply says you can use COVID for, or you can use sick leave for COVID-related events, couldn't we leave that basically as a permanent policy?
Mm-hmm.
That's what the current motion on the floor would achieve.
Yeah, I would say yes, but we don't know the implications at this point of it, right? I'm more hesitant to just accept it outright, because then if we get to a point where it's no longer an issue, what does that look like for our manual and for negotiating when we look at contracts, or unions issues and things like that. That's kind of what I'm personally inclined to say. It expires and then we can renew it once we have a better handle of what it looks like at the end of this year. But I'm open to how the rest of the council feels.
Who was that, Mr. Young?
Yes. Both sides of that argument really works, because I think that the main point is that COVID will be around for long times to come. And so if it's COVID related, then it allows you to be able to use this time under these conditions. So I'm open to either one of them. I think that at the end of the day, if it's COVID, you can be able to use it. And if not, that's okay. So.
Right. Mr. Walters.
I think that the personnel policy manual needs a complete page 1 rewrite anyway, just for structure. So that needs to get done, and that would provide an opportunity to fix this if we accidentally left it in there for 2 or 3 years. But also, if we want to set it to expire at the end of the year, I'm fine with that anyway, because this is an evolving situation, and we'll keep revisiting these things as necessary.
Mayor Gear?
Yes, Ms. Moulton.
I support the idea of the December 31st expiration date, just in case we don't do anything about it later and it ends up being one of those things.
You want to amend your motion, Mr. Walters?
I think anyone should feel free to amend my motion. But let me propose such an amendment. I move that we amend the motion on the floor to have an effective date of January 1 and an expiration date of December 31st, 2021.
Okay. And the motion still, the second still stands?
No, there should be a second on that amendment.
Second to the amendment.
Second to the
I,
amendment.
I second the amendment.
All right, so we have we've amended the motion by Mr. Walters, and we have a second to that motion. Any other discussion? All right, Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
So we're voting on the amendment now, only to add the dates. Mr. Young,
Yes.
Mr. Walters,
Yes.
Ms. Cleland McGrath,
Yes.
Ms. Moulton,
Yes.
Mr. McDougall,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Carter.
Yes.
Okay, the amendment carries. The motion as amended is ready for vote unless there's further discussion.
For the discussion? All right, Ms. Hunt, would you take the vote?
So voting to approve resolution 3012, only section 1, not section 2, and with an effective date of January 1st, 2021, and an expiration date of 12/31/21. Mr. Walters,
Yes.
Ms. Cleland McGrath,
Yes.
Ms. Moulton,
Yes.
Mr. McDougall,
Yes.
Mr. Miller,
Yes.
Mr. Carter,
Yes.
Mr. Young.
Yes.
Motion carries.
All right, well, thank you, everyone. Great discussion. And at this time, I will adjourn the meeting. See you all next Tuesday, as Monday is a holiday. All right, good night.